Hello everyone, my name is Pixlriffs and welcome back to the Minecraft Survival Guide. I hope you're all having a good day. In today's episode, I've started building over here at the Windy City. I couldn't help it. I was working on some designs in creative for this build in particular, and I just thought, let's go ahead and do it. Let's do one tower at least. And then hopefully I can provide you some insight into my building process with half of the build already done. Here's the thing. I know a lot of you folks watching this aren't going to be building the same stuff as me. And so providing a block-by-block tutorial for something I'm building in my survival world often feels a little bit redundant. It feels like the kind of thing that, unless you wanted to build this exact thing, and it might not fit in whatever vision of your world you have in mind, like you're probably not going to build a tower like this in your medieval worlds, it's not even going to be a tutorial you will want to follow, and that's a lot easier to click away from. So what I'm thinking is, I want to provide a little bit of insight into my thought process when building some stuff like this. And this is a build that I have drafted in creative mode beforehand, in a super flat world, based on some concept art. So I'll show the concept art on screen very briefly. This is the cover image for a kit bash file, like basically a series of assets that you can use in a 3D modeling environment in order to create a city, whether that's for your own artwork or whether it's for a video game project or something like that, or even just concept art itself. You can assemble these models in a way that makes sense for the world you want to create. And I found that a while ago just browsing for concept art images for a steampunk city. And when I found that initially, I was tinkering with a much larger design than this. I was trying to reproduce as many details of that concept art piece as I could, which meant scaling things up quite dramatically from the version you're seeing here in the survival guide world, because of course, all of those details have to fit within the Minecraft block grid, and that's actually fairly difficult to do with the level of sub-block details Minecraft gives you. Things like slabs and stairs can really help with those more complex shapes, but you have to build on quite a large scale if you want to reproduce the thing exactly. What I've done instead is a loose interpretation of that. I've decided to just take some of the highlights of that, like the large circular window at the base of the tower I thought looked really cool, and I wanted to reproduce that in some way. Also the kind of keyhole shaped tower, that's something you see a lot in like Middle Eastern architecture and Muslim architecture. I ended up using that as well because it made a really interesting window shape compared to all of the square windows and the arched windows that we had to have further down the build, simply because there wasn't enough room on the surface of the tower to actually fit in more interesting shaped windows. The roof shape is a little bit difficult to see from ground level, but you can kind of see it a little bit more from the view of the monorail. It's flatter on top, but has this nice kind of curved section to it that I really liked, and I thought, sure, let's do something that feels like a rough reproduction of the version that you see in the concept art, with a few more adornments in the form of those trapdoors that you see up there to kind of shape out the top of the tower a little bit and give it a bit more character. And the version you're going to see in my creative test world in a moment, once we hop over to there, has a second tower and a connecting bridge, much like the concept art piece does. So I've got all that stuff planned out. I'm not using any mods to reproduce it here in the survival guide world. I'm not using like Matica or anything that I've used in previous series. I'm just working from screenshots, copying things over, counting blocks along, and feeling out what feels right. Because in the creative test version, I didn't actually finish any of the side or back textures of the tower or make any decisions about what was there. I just put in some flat walls because I knew what the shape overall was going to be, and I wanted to leave myself more decisions to make when this build was placed in survival, and I knew what else was going to go around it. The first decision I've made here, though, is to slightly change the proportions of where this is going to be. Like, I wanted this to come out to the edge of the road that I had here in the city, and it turns out that once I started placing down the base of the tower, it really felt like it came out into the road by a couple of blocks. And so whether this shifts back the row of shops that I had planned here, or whether we remodel this entirely, that remains to be seen. I think we might actually end up changing up some of the scale just based on how big this first build has been, but we'll see. We'll see if we end up changing the scale of the city itself and redoing some of these outlines, or whether the outlines can still serve their original purpose. One thing that is for sure, though, I'm going to change the position of the fan that I built here, which is a relatively small build, so it shouldn't take too long to move it over a little bit, but now the fan taking people up to the station concourse is going to be around here, I would imagine, because this set of towers is actually going to support a building that's going to end up on the cliff face here, and I had to move these archways, or at least remove half of that one to build the tower, and I think the archway is now going to go here, which means our ticket kiosk is probably getting pushed back into the cliff wall here, and we might end up building some other stuff surrounding it, supporting it, or anything like that. But I think for the moment, our kind of station plaza area is going to be shifted over slightly, and this is going to be the case a lot of the time when you're working with stuff you've planned in creative and are bringing over into survival. If you have a rough idea of the space you want to work with, then that's fine, but the scale at which you're working in creative, the freedom you have with placing those blocks, is something that's going to change the shape of whatever you build later in survival. At least that is my experience so far. But we're getting off track here. The point is to focus on the build, and what I want to do with this build particularly is break down how I've adapted this piece of concept art into a Minecraft build. We're going to start really with looking at the texture of the build itself, because the majority of this is made out of red terracotta. When I looked at the concept art image, red terracotta was the material that I thought most closely matched the material of the tower itself. It was going to look like a nice flat plain base upon which we could add all of these details, like all of the curvature of the windows and the other adornments to the building. But often in Minecraft, I find that if you want to make a build look good or look natural, then you have to make some decisions that go beyond just choosing one material for your build. Let me hop over into my super flat world and I'll explain what I mean. So here in my super flat world, I want to take you through a few options for how to decorate a flat wall in Minecraft, and some of these are going to feel like fairly extreme examples, but bear with me here. I have this notion that there are basically 4 main ways that you can decorate a wall in Minecraft. The first over here is flat colors, the second is texture, the third is gradient, and the fourth is shading. Now here in my super flat world, I ended up using red concrete as the base color for this example, and here we're pairing it with a stripped mangrove log. This is an interesting contrast because you think of mangrove logs as red when you put them down in the world, and then you compare them to something that is such a bright, saturated red, and you find that they don't actually look all that red at all. What they're providing in this case is a little bit of texture, something that breaks up the individual block texture and gives it a bit more natural feel, a little bit more life, something that looks like, it might be a rough wall of some kind, and above that is plastered and painted, and it feels much more organized. A lot of people, I will say, don't get past this phase in their Minecraft builds, and I think personally, stylistically, that's totally fine. A lot of people prefer clean lines, bright colors, clear separation between materials when they're building something in Minecraft, and often it can feel like a more realistic approach because when you're looking at the world around you, typically the human eye glosses over a lot of these small details. If you look at a brick wall, you think that's a brick wall, and then you build a brick wall in Minecraft out of regular brick blocks, and if you're like me, you're suddenly reminded about how plain the brick texture is, or how repetitive the brick texture is. Every single one of these bricks is shaded basically the same way. There are subtleties, of course, to the individual bricks within a single block of the texture, and there's even some subtlety to the lighting of that block as long as you're using the vanilla lighting engine, so there's a darker side to bricks and a lighter side. But in the real world, bricks are so diverse and varied. They've been weathered differently, they've been fired differently, they have stuff growing on them a lot of the time, especially in older buildings, and sometimes there might be plaster that's chipping away, there might be mortar that is wearing away in between the bricks, and that gives a wall character, where in Minecraft, to me, this looks plain and flat and boring. It can work in the right context, don't get me wrong. I think a wall of bricks like this has its place, but its place is surrounded by other things that make it look a lot less plain and mundane and repetitive. And that's where we get onto our second option. The second option is what I think of as texture, and a lot of the times this texture is applied sort of randomly. We'll get onto really specific examples of applying texture in a second, but this kind of wall is something where you've got a base color and you've broken it up with a few extra blocks to either add texture or color variety, or potentially both. The majority of this, I would say probably 60 to 70% of this example, is still that red concrete block that we use there as our base, but we've mixed in a few other materials. We have some mangrove planks, there's a little bit of stripped mangrove peeking in at the bottom here, and then this, surprisingly, is actually red terracotta. You'd think it'd be undyed terracotta just from the fact that it looks very pale and pink in comparison, but once again, if I pick block that, it is red terracotta. The pale terracotta looks like this by comparison, and that almost feels like white terracotta, but then you take white terracotta and it looks a lot lighter and honestly looks much closer to white than you would expect it to, especially if you placed white terracotta out there in the world or you're looking at it next to other white items in the creative inventory. If you place white concrete here now, that looks almost blue by comparison because of the amount of red material it's surrounded by. And so the notion behind texturing a wall like this is to create both a little bit of color variety so it feels like there is character in the wall. The wall has aged somewhat, and if it's painted pure red, then there are going to be some spots where rain or other elements or human contact has worn away sections of the material. And I often liken this to the way comics artists will texture something like a brick wall in the background of a comic strip. If you look at any like New Yorker cartoon or Far Side Gallery comic strip from back in the day, you will see that there are occasional sketches of little brick wall sections in something that's supposed to be a larger flat wall. And the comics artist has typically implied that there are bricks in that wall just by leaving a couple of areas of detail and leaving the rest as a flat color or a flat texture, simply because that would draw the eye in too much and it would detract from other details in the scene. It makes the stuff in the front of it busier and harder to look at once you start adding details in the foreground. This is meant to be background detail, and so background texture really needs to adhere to this sort of 70-30 rule of flat color and plain texture to detail and something that can draw the eye in, or at least give the illusion that a material is being used here. Now, some folks might not like the randomness of this, and this is honestly, like I said, a fairly extreme example. We've got a huge contrast, it feels like, between the red concrete and the mangrove planks, because the mangrove has darker sections and lighter sections, and when side by side with red concrete, really doesn't feel all that red. It's got a lot of like pink and yellow and other colors in there in the texture, but realistically, if you put this next to some other stuff, it's going to stand out and look really red, so it's all about the context. If you made a wall like this out of plain grey material, you'd have a lot more to work with. If you made the entire thing stone, but these details were stone bricks, and the terracotta that I put in here was maybe andesite or something else that blends really well with stone, the effect is going to be a lot more subtle, but you're using the same variety of blocks, and it's just implying a little bit of texture. In fact, let's build that up right now. I'm going to use tuff down here in this corner as a more extreme example, but then everything else I'm going to cover over with what I think the equivalent block is in the stone texture palette. There you go, something like that. If I showed you that and said this is the wall of a castle or a city wall where the fortifications were made of stone, you wouldn't bat an eyelid, right? Like, that seems like a normal castle wall to you, and so the material choices here are everything. The next example we're going to move on to is gradients, and once again, very extreme example here. So often you wouldn't find people using gradients that only use one block in like an obvious stripe at a time. You would find people dithering, which is the technical term for when you take some of the material and kind of checkerboard it slightly on the joins between material like this, so we'd end up putting some of the concrete powder down here mixed in with the wool, and then from a distance especially, that would start to look more like a smooth transition between those colors instead of a really harsh line between them. But the idea with gradients is to start with a darker color and end in a lighter color, or vice versa, of course, or just smoothly transition between two colors of similar brightness and saturation. With the right choices of materials, it's possible to create a gradient between basically any colors in the game. There are a lot of interesting transitions that you can see between individual blocks that will add up into something that feels quite dramatic but quite colorful at the same time. Once again, when starting this gradient, I've used the red concrete as the base material. I've tried to find the next blocks that are lighter and darker in that same red color, and then from there we've gone even darker into the range, trying to match texture a little bit as well where we can, but then obviously blackstone and nether brick look very, very different next to each other. The goal there is just to provide a shadowy enough texture because there isn't a black brick block in the game really, aside from maybe deep slate tile. Maybe we can use that. Yeah, maybe that works just as well, but I find it sometimes has those like lighter highlights in the texture that don't really merge well with other types of brick, and the texture is just off enough from brick that you might as well use something like blackstone, because at that point the texture no longer matters. Obviously, as you get into the lighter range, we've also lost some of the highlights in some of these blocks. We're using red terracotta, regular terracotta, and then finally packed mud, since it has slightly more lighter areas in it than the flatter texture of terracotta. And some people, again, might find that the difference in textures here is kind of unbearable. But the goal of gradients really is to be seen from a distance and provide something that looks like a smooth transition from one color to another. You'll notice now, looking at it from this far away, that deep slate patch in the corner is actually really standing out compared to the transitions between the rest of the blocks. It's kind of like a magic eye picture almost. If you blur your eyes, you're supposed to just see one smooth transition of color instead of all of these individual blocks. And that's why you don't find people doing this with walls all that much, or if they do, it's with larger bands of material. It's with 3 or 4 block areas of material that just slowly gradiate up into the next block and the next block above that. I packed all of these blocks into this example though to really show you where the options lie, because you can go darker, you can go lighter, you can change up the pattern a little bit if you want to. But when it comes to materials like red, you don't have too many choices that don't veer off into the heavily textured. Look at wool next to concrete, look at the red nether brick next to the concrete, and you'll see that they are very, very different textures considering how flat the red concrete that we're starting with as our base texture is. And this is where we really want to start considering where in your world these techniques appear. Are these walls that you're going to be walking past at ground level fairly close up all the time? Or are they walls that you're going to be seeing from a distance more often than not? Are they even walls at all? You might be texturing roofs like this or ceilings. If you're walking past it this close, if you're only a couple of blocks away, you're only really seeing this material here and a little bit of the material above. And these two materials together are not causing a ton of visual noise as you walk past them. If you walk past our other texture example, you're getting maybe 1 or 2 things here, but it's no different really to passing by sections of a brick wall that are exposed in the middle of like plaster or something like that. And so you don't get too much visual noise going on, and it also follows the range of motion that your character is going to have. I haven't made any vertical stripes in this texture. I've done a lot of horizontal ones, and that really feels like this is something that's meant to be walked past. It implies a direction of motion, I suppose. This gradient, on the other hand, feels really strange to walk past because the wall next to you is constantly changing. There is this light to dark idea going on here, and you're also seeing maybe 4 or 5 different blocks in your field of view over there on the left hand side, so it feels like you're seeing the concrete powder, the wool, the concrete, and the 3 different types of bricks we have here. That's 6, assuming you don't even look up and see the rest of the wall. So there's a bit more visual noise going on here as you walk past it. This could feel like a mural or something like that in the context of a city, but it's not necessarily going to feel like a natural wall that you'd walk past in the real world. The strength of gradients I often find is when they are seen from a distance. That's why a lot of the gradients I've used in the survival guide already have been in roofs and things that are really designed to be viewed from the ground and at a distance, or when I'm flying around my world. Or in larger builds like the storage room, I've used them for the walls, but that's really to show the different transitions between the different wood types, and I don't tend to walk past those walls very close because I'm walking into the building to get to all of my storage, and if I walk around the outside, I'm walking along the paths or I'm flying. But the other thing you can do with gradients is show that light to dark transition, and that can often make sense when you're building something like a roof. If the darker sections are going to be lower down the line of the roof because there's less sunlight hitting them than the peak of the roof, which is going to be getting sunlight at all hours of the day. And so gradients between different types of materials can sort of imply lighting without it being natural consequence of the Minecraft lighting engine. And that is really where we're going to move on to our last example here, which is shading. Now, once again, this is a very extreme example, and I'll also preface by saying I'm not very good at this technique. It's not one I've tried to employ all that much, because this is the point at which Minecraft crosses over into being a painterly environment. You're thinking about sources of light, where they exist in the scene, and how they affect the materials around them. So I think the first thing I should point out about this is, despite having considered this a red concrete wall to start with, I'm actually not using any red concrete in here at all. The most I've gotten to is these highlights of red concrete powder to imply that yes, there is still color there. But what I'm imagining, actually, I can probably set the time to night to give you a better example of what I'm envisioning here. I'm imagining the play of light on this wall and the way that the glow of the lamp above would change the color of the material of the wall. So if you imagine like a sodium lamp bulb, they're typically very orange, and so it's going to add more orange into what would already be a red material. So red and orange share a lot of the same color, and those would end up playing together on this wall. But there's also going to be a point on the wall up at the top here where I put in some yellow terracotta where the light hits with the most strength, and then from there the light is going to fall off, and I'm imagining this kind of spotlight cone of light playing against the side of the wall here from this lighting fixture above it. And so I've drawn out a rough cone shape using some of the lighter colors here, and then around the outside, sort of using a similar technique to the gradient, I've started to fill in with darker and darker colors until at the end here we actually have some black concrete powder to imply shadows. And the whole thing right now really looks like the flame of a candle rendered in pixel art or something like that. And again, this has such a weird selection of textures that if you walk past it just casually with a 3-block distance, like I was saying, if this was like a city street or something and you walked past this, you would assume that this was a painting or a mural or something like that instead of being a typically textured wall, because the choices I've made here are very extreme. Once again, if you rendered this in stone and you had a more subtle grey color palette to work with, it might have turned out slightly differently, but the idea here is to show the extremes of what you can work with when it comes to the play of light and dark on a surface. And once again, this is the kind of thing that looks a little bit easier to understand when you view it from a distance. Similar to the gradient patch here, some of the subtleties of the nether brick blending into the darker texture of the concrete powder ends up blurring together at a distance, and what you end up seeing instead is this vague outline of red. There is this sort of loose glow to it as that light fades off into the surroundings, and you end up with something that looks a bit more like a spotlight is being cast on a wall. Obviously, it helps if you can see the frog lights a little bit, so it's perhaps best viewed from ground level. But setting the time back to day, it still has a similar effect. Again, the idea is to sort of bypass Minecraft's own lighting engine and create light in the scene, encourage the viewer to look at objects as though they are lit, even if the game engine isn't providing that light. This isn't the only way you can apply shading as well. It doesn't all have to be light-based. It can be based on how the material might have aged, and there are lots of examples of this out there where people have used it to decorate flat surfaces and still give them texture, and like segments of a pillar and life like that can kind of spring out from them. And I don't really have the experience yet with this technique to give you much better examples than just telling you to go and watch builders like B00 who are always doing interesting stuff with shading and texture. But the point here is that we have a few very different approaches, and we can take little bits and pieces of all of these back into the survival guide world as we work on this tower, which I did promise you a look at, by the way, so let me show you the version of it that I built here in this creative world. There are chickens on the roof because of an in-joke, but outside of that, this is the tower that I built in the survival guide world already, minus a couple of the details here, and the tower on the opposite side is the one that we're going to be building together. This has a big, what I'm thinking of as a large copper drum on it that's got some kind of mysterious, I assume, power source inside of it. It could be diesel. I think that's the idea in the steampunk version of it, is it's meant to be some sort of like fuel reservoir, but in the version that I'm building, I don't know, because all of this stuff is going to be wind powered, so maybe there is an energy converter, some sort of transformer in there, or a turbine or something, and these are vents that allow some of the air in so that the turbine can spin. I don't know. I'm not certain exactly about the level of technology that I want to imply here, but what I've done is sketch out the facade of this tower, and I've made some choices going back into the survival guide world about proportions, namely that I made the towers a little bit too thin in this version, so I've actually made them slightly larger and made the side faces about the same width as the end faces. But aside from that, this tower is basically cloned over from one side to the other, and a couple of subtle details have been changed. This bridge section has been made with a lot of trapdoors around there, which look very strange up close like this. When you're looking at them from the side, this really doesn't look like the kind of thing that would be framing a window. But once again, I'm not expecting to see this build from that angle. I'm expecting to see it from down here, where that simply looks like the ornamentation that would occur to frame a window in a real-life building. But as I've been working on this build, I decided to go with that occasional textured approach instead of using a gradient or something a bit more involved like this shading, for a couple of reasons. First of all, this is going to be a fairly tall building. It's going to stand out in the city, and as such, I don't think the shading approach really applies, because I'm imagining the sun hitting this thing at all hours of the day. Secondly, I think even with the variety of materials that we have, red is really difficult to make into a gradient. It's actually quite tough to imagine a gradient starting from the bottom of this and going all the way to the top and not being really obvious where the transitions between materials were. Like, there's a bit of a similarity between the streakiness that is present in a red terracotta block and the streakiness that you get in a mangrove log, but some of the textures really start to become obvious when placed next to each other. Even the mangrove planks that I've used here look very texturally different to everything else, and the idea was that in trying to emulate the piece of concept art that I found originally, there really isn't too much difference in the texture of that piece. It's simply shaded in such a way that it implies a shadow lower down and a bit more light hitting the tops of the towers. And I don't think that the Minecraft block palette is quite subtle enough to have that full range of lighting in there without radically changing texture and color. So the majority of where I've done any kind of shading inside of here is underneath the arches, where I've left it mostly mangrove wood. That's also because I knew I had a lot of mangrove available to me in Survival Guide. I've been farming mangrove for a while, so thankfully I have a great deal of it. And also I thought that maybe underneath this archway is where there'd be a few more shadows present. So we can do a little bit more treatment of the shading and stuff, but I could also work a little bit with texture, imagining this vent here is leaking some sort of fluid that maybe has prompted the moss that's growing on the nearby rocks to climb up the wall because it's being fed by this stream of water or whatever that's venting out of this area. I've also used a little bit of glow lichen to have that both as an organic growth creeping up around the rocks here, but also maybe to show a little bit of patchy staining where a pipe has leaked at one time or another. But overall, these are small details. They're not necessarily something that's going to stand out when you see the build from a distance, and that's the idea. These subtle ideas blend in with everything else. So even though this is a Minecraft Survival Guide episode and we've spent most of our time here in creative, hopefully that's given you some insight into the process of building this. Now we're going to head back into the Survival Guide world, and we're actually going to build the tower step by step. So back here in the Survival Guide world, we're going to build the left-hand tower and the connecting bridge. I've already laid the tough foundations over here, and I haven't started putting in the glow lichen on this one yet, but you can see I've done a little bit of texture already with the moss cobble around here and the moss growing up the side there. Haven't installed that side vent yet. I was just drafting little sketches of ideas in the super flat world. I'm not certain that's exactly how I want to do it, but I do want to have some sort of like heating vent or something that the moss is growing up towards. We've got all the material in here though, and with the foundation laid, the first thing I'm going to do is lay down a big old chunk of red terracotta and mangrove. And the other thing to consider is how much of the tower space here is taken up by pre-existing terrain, and whether we actually want to build the entirety of the tower in here up against whatever terrain exists, or whether we want to just build the bits that are exposed and leave the rest of this terrain to imply that there is a remainder of the tower beyond. I'm actually going to try building it so it blends in with the cliffside here and just leave the existing cliff here, although there might be some aspects of this that we change around and mess with the terrain slightly, so I'll keep a screenshot of this build on speed dial just in case I need to fill in some areas that become exposed as we start landscaping. I think one of the decisions I always struggle with is whether to add in some of the texture first or whether to go back afterwards and add in the texture once the entire tower is built, and you can take a look at where it feels like it needs the lighter and darker areas, because you can do a little bit of shading in your texturing. You can put the darker blocks in areas where it feels like they would be darker, and that can add a subtle amount of shading to it instead of the exaggerated example we saw in the super flat world. But it's easy to get caught up in the texturing of things and forget where you are in the build. It's also a little bit more difficult to see what that looks like close up when you're working on a build, and it's a lot easier to step away and take a look at where the build needs texture afterwards. So in this case, I might actually just block most of it in red terracotta, only using the mangrove for this wall because I know that that's going to be the inside wall and therefore is going to be a little darker. And then I'll go back and do a texture pass once the shape of the towers is in place. The best thing about having one of these towers already built is that you don't have to do as much counting to make sure certain areas of the build hit certain heights. You can just copy over what's on the opposite side. Once we get above the line of this chiseled tough bracer that's around the tower, I am going to switch to the red terracotta from there, which is a relief honestly, because stripping all of the mangrove is an extra step that feels a little bit tedious at times. And now we're up to the height of the roof. We should have that entire wall taken care of, so let's swing on down and take a look. It's very obvious where the join is going to be, but that's part of the reason behind some of these external details, is to hide joins like that and make them feel more natural. Now I've got an idea of the height we're going to reach. Let's use the rest of the blocks to just fill in the outline of the tower. And I've just got to the top of this tower and I've heard a zombie, which I'm pretty sure means that we've got a dark space in there that a zombie has spawned in. Anyone in here? Ah, yes, there you are. Oh, and there's a creeper in there as well. gosh, okay, we ought to be a little more careful than that then. And yeah, there's some ledges in here that could maybe do with lighting up. That's another thing that I rarely consider when it comes to the interiors of these things, is lighting them up. Because this build in particular is really meant to be an aesthetic build. It's going to have the station attached to the back of it, but the towers themselves are not going to have interiors that I'm worried about decorating fully. And likewise, I'm keeping the back of these towers flat and undetailed, simply because we're going to attach the station building to them, and I'm not quite sure how that's going to turn out yet. So with the tower shape all built in, the next thing I'm going to do is work on the external details, actually. It feels like this should be the last thing you add, but really, if you're looking to do a texture pass on this thing, you're going to want to change up the blocks that are visible from the outside. There's no point changing something where the outside of it is going to be obscured by one of these details, like the dark oak detailing that I put around the window here. You'll also notice this tower is missing the recess that one has, so I haven't copied it over one for one, because this one's going to have that big copper tank in front of it that's going to be leading pipes around the rest of the structure. And now with the details filled in, this tower obviously looking a lot more like this tower, and the symmetry really helps the two of them, but also just having a bit of that extra external detail really helps. Looking at the frames of the windows provided by obviously the joins in the tinted glass that we're using for the windows there, I think that just looks really solid. Before we do our texture pass, I'm going to add the bridge connecting the two of these, since that is still a missing element, and I think after that we're going to be able to do the texture. The way I've chosen to texture this tower is a little different on the top versus the bottom. I assume on the bottom that the grime and dirt from the street would be coating the bottom of the tower, which is why I've gone for darker and slightly more noisy textures in the form of the mangrove and the mangrove planks, and maybe consider that this is actually a structure made out of wood, and the plank texture is showing through where the paint has really worn down here. But then up there, I've gone for a different approach, deciding that maybe if the paint wears off, it wears down to a more neutral terracotta color, and we've mixed in regular terracotta amongst the red terracotta that I'm using elsewhere, and a little bit of mangrove, that kind of street grime, and maybe a little bit of exhaust from the trains or whatever. Although at this point we're still working with wind power, so I'm not sure exhaust for the trains is a thing, but I like the idea at least of having a bit of texture up there in the top of the tower, and it starts to highlight some of the window frames and stuff a little better, where here obviously it stands out well enough just because of the depth of the windows and the extra detail that we've added to the outside, but this just helps them pop out a little bit more from the flat surface of the color of the tower. But anyway, before we go any further, before we put the roof on this or add any of the texture, like I said, I'm going to work on the bridge section connecting these towers. So the bridge section is mostly done. I'm really happy with this, actually. I think there's a couple of materials that are still missing from the other side, though. I didn't have enough tinted glass to finish out the windows, so it's a little bit of light shining on through. But to be honest, I don't mind that too much. It really depends what we do with the back half of the building, really. And I've left some of the details missing from the back half because it's probably a good idea to not overcommit to that stuff if I think the back half of this is going to change. So I haven't added in the fences and chains that add that distinctive line down the center, kind of gives everything a little bit more detail, helps things feel a little bit more busy, but detailed at this scale typically means ornate. Or at least it's supposed to pass for ornate, right? It's meant to look a little bit well-engineered in there. So hopefully that comes across. And the copper tank here is actually stripped acacia wood and then some stripped warped wood along with some accents. Basically wherever there is a curve or a bend in the pipe, there's going to be an oxidized copper block there just to look like there are, rivets and stuff holding things together, a join between two directions of pipe. But that's going to stick out from this tower by one block. It's going to have copper blocks on the corners surrounded by these acacia trapdoors, and stripped acacia in the middle with the acacia wood texture with the six-sided bark and the six-sided strip texture so you don't see the seams. We're going to wrap one of these pipes around the back of the build like so. It's simply going to look like it joins to the wall right here, and the other one is going to go around this side of the building, wrap up underneath the bridge, and connect on the other side. And we'll have another pipe coming out lower down to give the illusion that the pipework actually runs through the building and out the other side. Once again, we'll affix this pipe to the back of the build here, and I'm not certain exactly whether that's going to connect to the station building or not, so we can always alter that later if we need to. But the overall effect we're going for here, and I think we've managed to pull it off, is this very bright blue color, this injection of a cold color into a build that's using a very warm palette. And that really makes it stand out as a detail, which I think looks kind of cartoony, but that's the whole vibe of this area so far. So I think the final stage that remains is to put the roof on and then finally do a bit of a texture pass on this half of the towers, but it's going very well. I think this actually looks really nice as part of a structural element to our city. So far, if we take a look at it from a distance, it's really going to stand out and set the scale for the rest of the builds. So there we go. The second tower has the roof all added to it, including the little roof ornaments there, and and the only thing I have left to do around the outside, I think, is add in the fences and lanterns to light up the lower part of the build, and then we're on to the texture pass, where I'm going to add some mossy cobblestone to this tough foundation here. We'll add a little bit of mangrove strip log and mangrove planks into the lower half, and then dot those around the upper half while adding some of those highlights with the regular terracotta. And that should just give it a little bit more texture, a little bit more visual interest, when right now, while it looks like structurally kind of an interesting building, texture-wise it feels kind of bland, and I think it definitely needs to match its neighboring tower, so let's go ahead and add a bit of that. And there we go, a short time later the towers are more or less complete, and I'm gliding towards the nether portal, so I'll stop there and turn around. I still want to do a little bit of texturing here and there, but on the back here especially, I'm going to leave it as is, simply because I don't know what's going to connect to the back of this yet, but the station building will come in here, and if there's any visible stuff on the backs of these towers after that, maybe we'll do a texture pass on that as well. But you can take it easy, you can do it in stages if you don't have the time to do a ton of this stuff. It does take a lot of extra time, especially once you've completed the shape of a build. You realize the build isn't quite finished, and then you need to go and add in all of this texture, which often takes the longest to get just right. But I still have some ideas about what I'm going to put in this little recess in that building there. I wanted to do maybe a display with copper bulbs flickering on and off or something like that, but I will work on that another time. For now, I'm happy just having this structure in here, and we can take a look from a few different angles of how it looks as part of a centerpiece for the Windy City over here. I think finally having a build in this place is going to be very motivating for me to get some other stuff built around here, because this thing just on its own, nah, we need more than that. We definitely need more than that. Well, it's taken me a little while to get to this video, and today, the day that I'm releasing this, is actually the day that the Pale Garden update comes out, recently retitled The Garden Awakens, and so expect a couple of extra videos this week and the next as we dive into the Pale Garden, all of its features, and what new blocks we can get from that area. We're probably going to be harvesting a lot of the new pale oak wood, interacting with the creaking, and probably getting hold of some resin as well. So stick around for more episodes, but for now, that is going to be it for this episode of the Minecraft Survival Guide. Let's frame ourselves with the arch in the background as we say thank you so much for watching this episode. My name has been Pixlriffs. Don't forget to leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you folks soon. Take care. Bye for now.